and he has completed his DM Neurology from Nemans. He then subsequently decided to train further and came to the UK. This is actually where I met Lokesh. It's about, when was it? 2006, I think. So yes, he was a fellow in pediatric neurology in Bristol already, and I had joined there for my training. And I remember a number of years having wonderful ward rounds with him, and I've received a lot of guidance and training from him. So I'm very grateful to him for that. He has then moved back to India, and at the moment he's a very successful consultant child neurologist at Rainbow Children's Hospital, Women and Children's Hospital in Hyderabad, where he has his own child neurology department. I have visited the hospital, and it's a fantastic institute, a standalone children's hospital with all the facilities under one roof, and they are providing an excellent service to the city and as a tertiary unit to the whole region. He has been secretary of AOCN, that is the Child Neurology Association of India, from 2014 to 16. And currently he's the chairperson of the IAP Neurology subsection. And today's topic is how to approach a child with drug refractory epilepsy. So throughout the last 3 days, we've learned about diagnosis, choosing the right AED, office practice of pediatric epilepsy. And today we reach the most difficult part of pediatric epilepsy, which unfortunately is true in 25 to 30% of children. They do not seem to be responding to drugs alone. So what are the options? How do we counsel these parents? And Lokesh is going to, in the next 1 hour or so, take us through that. For all the participants, whilst the session is going on, do write your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box. We will take note of it. And at the end of the session, hopefully we'll get Dr. Lokesh Lingappa to answer all of these questions. So over to Lokesh from here.
Okay. Thank you, Sid, for that kind introduction. So I think you have had a nice sessions over last 4 days with eminent speakers, including Sid, Nitish, and his team, and also with Dr. Rajesh and Anaita. So a lot of things would be probably revision of what you have heard. There might be many new people who have joined in. I will share my screen. So me, Nitish, and Siddharth were colleagues in UK, and that seems very new, sort of, we were meeting in a interview hall once in Great Ormond Street. That's what that is still very fresh, and we are here many years later working in India and making a difference to the society. I think all of us, these teaching sessions are a good way of interacting, although it's a new way of interacting. But what I would suggest to all the people who are sitting out there in their homes and listening, or at the work and listening, to keep on raising questions. I will actually take this session through in the sort of lot of question answer sessions. So when I ask a question, please do put it up in the chat box so that me or Sid or Nitish, anybody can answer the questions as it goes through. So drug refractory seizures or epilepsy, actually, when as a pediatrician, if I hear that word, I feel it's not my job. Why should I know about it? But as a pediatrician, I think you can make a lot of difference in managing these children with so-called drug refractory epilepsy. So it may not be all of them are drug refractory epilepsy. So there are a lot of definitions, operational definitions. If you have failed 2 medications with more than 1 seizure a month for 2 years was the initial thing. But now they are all looking down at 2 medications, appropriate dosage medications of 1 or more seizure per month. And they don't wait for this 2 years period. They just, if the seizures are coming very frequently in even 6 months time, and the child is beyond sort of 2 years, and there is a surgically resectable lesion, they try to go ahead and evaluate for that. So that is for drug resistance. If you look at just a refractory epilepsy, as you know, all of us are aware that epilepsy affects approximately 1% of the population. And of this 1%, 30% of patients continue to have seizures despite the appropriate anti-epileptic medications. So as an overall, if you look at, if you diagnose a child with epilepsy first time, and then overall, if in your counseling, if you have all the information on your EEG or syndromic diagnosis, you can give accurate long-term outcome. So 50% of the seizures have good prognosis. When you don't have a syndromic diagnosis, child had 2 seizures, normal MRI. So 50% of them have a good or excellent prognosis. 10 to 20% achieve seizure control, but you might have to add medications, subtract medications, dosages need to be raised, changed. All those things have to be done. So you probably achieve overall around 70% control of seizures, and surgery may improve outcome in some of these children. 30% of seizures have a bad prognosis as such. And here new AEDs or ketogenic diet and other things will have to be tried. And what are the predictors of good outcome at the beginning? If you have, by the time the child comes to you, they have less than weekly seizures prior to treatment, and a non-symptomatic etiology, that your scan is normal, your EEG shows occasional discharges, those kind of things will have a good outcome. What are the early predictive criteria for intractability? If they have frequent seizures as onset, frequent status epilepticus, encephalitic etiology, neuronal migration disorders, neonatal hypoglycemic brain injury, and poor response to initial appropriate AEDs, and genetic etiologies. So many of the genetic etiologies do have a poor long-term outcome. So I think epilepsy outcome, what we discussed as earlier, this is an adult study wherein they found that if somebody is responding to first AED with a very small dosage, they are the group of patients who respond very well. And what are the epilepsies with excellent prognosis? And 20 to 30% of epilepsies achieve long-term remission after variable period of time. Sometimes even without anti-epileptics like benign centrotemporal epilepsy or pharmacoresponsive epilepsy, age-related, those kind of things, they respond very well. Many of them may not require anti-epileptic. And if they respond to first or second successful monotherapy in modest dosages, they will be successful. So the examples include childhood absence epilepsy, benign centrotemporal epilepsy, and beyond neonatal seizures. So these are epilepsies with excellent prognosis even at the beginning. But there are epilepsies, whatever you do, they will probably require lifelong drugs. So 20 to 30% remain seizure free only with continued anti-epileptic therapy. In this group, not all of them might get seizure free. So 20 to 30% may remain seizure free, but with continued anti-epileptic for the life, like juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, those kind of conditions. Some require one AED or multiple different AEDs to find a right combination, and then you might achieve a control. The epileptogenic process does not truly remit, and seizures recur if treatment is withdrawn. So actually now the word for most of the anti-epileptics are changing towards anti-seizure medication, because most of the drugs don't act against the epileptogenic process. There are only few which will come through later on. So most of them are only anti-seizure drugs. They stop the seizurogenic process, not the epileptogenic process. So the examples include juvenile myoclonic epilepsies, many partial epilepsies, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. All these things are epilepsies where the tendency to have seizures, the epileptogenic process is lifelong, and they would require lifelong medications. So with this baseline, we'll go through in a practical situation, how do we tackle? So the steps are, once we are starting, is the diagnosis of epilepsy adequately established? That is the first and foremost. When you are struggling with drugs, come back to this question: is the diagnosis of epilepsy or epileptic seizure adequately established? Is the semiologic and electrophysiologic diagnosis securely established? Is the syndromic diagnosis and choice of drug are matching? Have adequate dosages been tried? How is the drug compliance? Then you come to truly refractory epilepsies. So as a pediatrician, I think you have a lot of scope, as you can see, to do the step 1 to step 5 before they go to their true refractory epilepsies. So this is a study from adults and some adolescent age group, wherein 214 patients were referred to a tertiary epilepsy care center for epilepsy surgery. As you can see, 49 of them were non-epilepsy. This is in the best of the Western centers, wherein 49 of 214, that is almost 20%, had non-epileptic events which were referred for epilepsy surgery. And on top of that, they were on multiple anti-epileptic medications. So this is a situation wherein in the best of the centers also you can have misdiagnosis and they are referred for epilepsy surgery evaluation as well. So these are the various groups of conditions: syncope, neurological disorders, endocrine metabolic disorders, including hypocalcemia, hypoglycemia, psychiatric disorders, dissociative disorders. All of them can contribute to your refractory epilepsies. I'll just go through one of the case. So this is very common scenario. Every day we see them. 9-month-old, normal birth and development. They were from Karnataka. 2 months history of sudden stiffening of body and clenching of teeth. Multiple episodes in a day. No relation to sleep, no regression of milestones. And it is always during the awake period. No relation to sleep is one of the important things. You know why I'm telling that. So once this is with this history, as a pediatrician, you start thinking of or worrying about whether it's epileptic spasms. So rightly, somebody investigated him outside. EEG was done, and unfortunately, some of the reporting, what happens in many of the places is they're reported on the printed EEG and was reported as suggestive of epilepsy. And it goes back to pediatrician with that report, and MRI was also written as query abnormal. So the pediatrician promptly started Valparin, no reduction of episodes, clonazepam added, no response. Third medication was also added. I'll show you the video. Just go through it and tell me whether you would have started anti-epileptic for this child. So he's alert, awake child. The father is asking him to do the episode. He's telling, do it again. And then he's obliging by doing it again. So we'll see that again. So fully alert and awake is doing that stiffening of the upper limbs and is fully playful, no loss of responsiveness. This child, this is not a, this one, it's a real life story. What this child had, he was on 3 anti-epileptics, including vigabatrin, because this was assumed as epileptic spasms. What is that?
So a few participants have mentioned shudder here.
Yeah, I think the poll, we'll take the poll.
Okay.
Yes, to all the participants, the poll is on now. And you can see it on the screen. We can put it for a few seconds. A very high response rates, already crossed 100 now. Maybe in last 7 seconds to go.
Pediatricians were well glued in. That's very appreciable.
I'm ending the poll, Dr. Lokesh now, and sharing the results with you, doctor.
Okay, sure. I think shuddering, most of them have got it right. Shuddering episodes is the right answer, because psychogenic non-epileptic events, they happen by around 8 years onwards. The brain is not mature enough to put up a psychogenic non-epileptic like event in young age group like this. So that is why, and shuddering is the most common thing what you see at this age group. And it is between 6 months to 1 year what you find it, always during the awake period, multiple episodes, variable frequency, no treatment that has to be given for this, just reassurance, no investigation is required. If you see this, we'll go ahead with the presentation. Okay, yeah, so everybody agrees it is shuddering episode. So we took off all the medications, is completely normal. Now look at this video. This is a similar age child. He's sitting there. He just woke up 5 minutes back from the sleep. And then you can appreciate that episode. It's just going back. You can see that again, just going back again. You can see that fraction of a second he may not be responsive. It's very difficult to make out, but there is a rhythm to it, and the relation to waking up from the sleep, and it always happens. So what is these episodes? Okay, so these are extensor spasms, epileptic spasms, extensor spasms, which is seen. So you can see, appreciate the difference between the two. Okay. So this is a child who once again was evaluated extensively, is a 9-year-old boy who was just nearing his exams and started having these frequent episodes during the day. You are sitting in outpatients, he just jerking and woke up, and then he sits down quietly. While we are discussing the history again and going through with the parents, he starts having the episode. He's able to maintain the posture. He is holding himself tight with it's a whole body jerking. So what do we think it is? So he had received 3 anti-epileptics in a span of 15 days, continued episodes only during the daytime, and he had some behavioral changes as well in the form of excessive crying. We'll just run that video once more. So just whole body jerking. He's able to maintain the balance. He's keeping his eye open. Multiple EEGs, MRIs were normal. So one of the significant thing is the differentials here would be what? It could be a part of myoclonus, but always he's taking support before that. If it is a generalized, you don't actually will be able to do that. So you just fall with those kind of jerks. So he's able to maintain, and it is very variable frequency. Suddenly it increases, suddenly decreases in frequency. So these things are noted in this psychogenic non-epileptic events. It's very common once again between the age of sort of 8 to 14 years of age in the pediatric practice. Whereas in adult practice, it is much more common. But in pediatric, it's between 8 to 14 years is what you see frequently. The diagnostic thing will be the ictal EEG. If you do a EEG during the recording, that shows the diagnostic abnormality that the EEG is normal during these episodes. Okay, we'll go to the next thing. Psychogenic non-epileptic events are an alternative explanation for refractory seizures, and relative frequency in a group of refractory seizures might range from 10 to 40% in various series. So doing a video EEG in capturing the episodes will make the diagnosis secure. So once you are starting a treatment and you are looking at, okay, this is a refractory epilepsy, make sure they are epileptic seizures, because these things can also present as refractory seizures. So this is a 8-year-old, 1-year history of infrequent generalized seizures, had around 2 or 3 generalized seizures, which were longest period was around 5 minutes. Had an EEG done, which was normal, and normal MRI. Initially started on levetiracetam, later on clobazam was added, failed. Then sodium valproate was added along with clobazam. The child was seizure free. So 3 drugs already tried. Then had a recurrence of generalized seizure. And this is after late night sleep. The child slept at 12 o'clock instead of usual 9:30. After this, what would be your response? So if you are treating in the outpatients, following up this child, what you do actually do? So here the child comes back to you after a recurrence in the optimal dosage of around 25 milligram per kg per day of sodium valproate, and then has come back with a seizure recurrence. But this child, the medication was changed to oxcarbazepine. Then what happens after that? After 2 months, recurrence of generalized tonic-clonic seizures, along with brief periods of the last 3 weeks, more early morning staring, more during the early morning period, and brief turning of head to left, and blank stare 5 seconds, no postictal phenomena, multiple per day, and no aura, no postictal phenomena. So the duration of the episode, frequency of the episodes, no postictal phenomena, all of them are suggesting absence. You have generalized tonic-clonic seizures, you have absences. So what happened here? So where did we go wrong? So it has become refractory. It started off as infrequent seizures. We have converted it to a refractory seizures. So this is the EEG, which shows spike polyspike wave discharges of 3 Hz frequency with a normal background, abrupt onset of discharges. You can see the classical polyspike wave discharges where they have prone to myoclonic epilepsy as well, abrupt offset. So this is, so we'll have the poll here.
Yes, to all the participants, the poll is on. What is the type of epilepsy and the 4 options? Okay, a bit slow to start with, crossing 100 now.
That's fine. That's a good this one.
Yeah. So I'll keep it for a few more seconds, Dr. Lokesh,
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
I'll give
sure,
it to
sure.
you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay, last 7 seconds to go.
sure.
3, 2,
Yeah,
1. I end the poll and
yeah,
share the results with
yeah,
Dr. Lokesh.
yeah.
Over to you, sir.
Yeah. See, the episodes of absence are very clearly there. The child also has generalized tonic-clonic seizures, but the EEG is suggestive of myoclonic tendency to have myoclonic epilepsy. So the childhood absence epilepsy, and later on they might develop myoclonus. The child is just 8 years in the idiopathic generalized epilepsy, which go on to JME kind of epilepsy. Usually they go into during the adolescent period. So childhood absence epilepsy, plus or minus whether they will develop myoclonic epilepsy, that would be the right. It is spectrum of idiopathic generalized epilepsy. This is not Lennox-Gastaut because cognitively normal. You have only generalized tonic-clonic seizures and brief absences. Atypical absences are known in Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, but not a, and the EEG is very classical for a sort of absence epilepsy, but the polyspike wave, anytime you see, it will show that this child is highly likely to have myoclonic epilepsy later on. So the childhood absence or myoclonic or idiopathic generalized epilepsy spectrum is the answer. Thank you. So it is very important that as a knee-jerk reaction, don't start another medication. At the point when the child came back with seizure recurrence, when the child had lost poor sleep, I would just sit back and think, okay, what is my syndromic diagnosis? This child has only generalized seizures. If you want, repeat EEG because initial EEG was normal. So if you find generalized discharges, only generalized seizures and recurrence, because you had a good control for 6 months with valproate, just optimize the dosage of valproate and lifestyle advice. So tell them not to have late night sleeps and all those things, and drug compliance need to be ensured. Then probably you wouldn't have landed into refractoriness or precipitating other types of problems. So all this as a pediatrician you can do. So this is a 4-year-old girl with a normal perinatal and family history. 4th month started having febrile seizures. I think everybody will start thinking of the diagnosis. Most of you are well aware of this diagnosis. Multiple febrile and afebrile seizures by 1 year of age. Phenobarbital, levetiracetam tried rightly, continued recurrences, occasional complex partial, myoclonus during fever. So you are having polymorphic epilepsy, generalized seizures, focal, myoclonus, all those things are seen. Sodium valproate added at around 1 year, better control, but continue to have recurrences. It's a difficult to control epilepsy. Then one of the adult neurologists was following up this child because sodium valproate and lamotrigine works well together. So with that concept, the lamotrigine was added. And this child had 3 episodes of myoclonic status epilepticus in 4 months. Actually, myoclonic status epilepticus is extremely rare phenomena in pediatric practice, adult practice even rarer. So something changed here. You added lamotrigine, you have 3 episodes of myoclonic status epilepticus in 4 months time. So what are we dealing with here? What went wrong? What is your syndromic diagnosis?
Yes, Dr. Lokesh, I have launched the poll. Let's wait for the participants to respond, please.
Yeah, yeah.
So all the doctors will request you to respond.
Yeah.
To this
So
question,
this child
please.
had early onset febrile seizure, prolonged seizures, multiple types of seizures, had a normal MRI, and had discharges, generalized discharges on the EEG, but not regressing at this point of time.
Okay, last 7 seconds to go before I give it to Dr. Lokesh.
Yeah, sure.
3, 2, 1. I end the poll, doctor, and share results with you, doctor.
Yeah.
Over to you, Dr. Lokesh.
Yeah, that a good enthusiastic participation, all of you. So I think this is a slight difference what we have. Genetic epilepsy with febrile seizure plus syndrome also will have all of these components, but they will not have usually prolonged status epilepticus. They will have an autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance. So, and the seizure frequency is not this high, they don't require generally multiple medications as this child has required. And the myoclonic epilepsy, which was prominent in this child, and a slight cognitive decline was seen later on when the child was around 5-6 years, but then they initially presented, it was not seen. So the diagnosis here would be severe myoclonic epilepsy of infancy borderland. So whenever you have an autosomal dominant presentation, the severity of the disease is low. Whereas whenever you have a cryptogenic or a sort of what you call sporadic onset, no family history, only the child is affected, sporadic mutation, you are seeing a more severe mutation. That is when you develop what is SMEI borderland is slightly less severe than Dravet. It is Dravet phenotype spectrum. It is also called SMEI borderland. So this child behaved like a child with SMEI. But that's a close differential genetic epilepsy. It's the same mutation, same SCN1A mutation, but it is autosomal dominantly inherited, less severe phenotype. So this child had heterozygous SC1 gene mutation seen in child but not in parents. So meaning it was a de novo mutation. So management plan, we withdrew the lamotrigine. Since then she never had myoclonic status, but she continued to have breakthrough seizures with a combination of ketogenic diet, sodium valproate, clobazam, and other levetiracetam. So what happened? It's a refractory epilepsy. We know that it is a refractory epilepsy, but because the syndromic diagnosis was not thought of, we added the drug with which could clearly exacerbate the existing seizures. So failure to make a syndromic diagnosis, inappropriate drug usage, apparent refractoriness. So this is where you as a pediatrician can chip in. So when you have increased seizures, sit back, think what is the type of seizure? Is it epileptic? Go back to the same first point. Is it epileptic? Yes. If it is epileptic, what is the semiology? Then what is the syndromic diagnosis? Do I have enough information on this for the syndromic diagnosis? Do I have my MRI? Do I have my EEG? Is, if required, genetic diagnosis as appropriate? So try and as much as possible get a syndromic diagnosis, because both the prognosis and the drug usage, as in this case, was all based on, we didn't do the genetic diagnosis initially. The genetic test came only a year later, but we knew that this was the SMEI just based on the history and the type of seizures the child was having. So as all of you know, I think Dr. Naita might have already reinforced this point. If you think of absence, don't use phenytoin, carbamazepine, those group of drugs. Myoclonus, phenytoin, carbamazepine. Lamotrigine is used in JME, but is known to exacerbate myoclonus. If you anytime think of GFS plus SMEI, which are the sodium channel abnormalities, avoid carbamazepine, lamotrigine, phenytoin, rufinamide, all these group of drugs. So that is why I think making this diagnosis, thinking of a syndromic diagnosis and using your medications appropriately becomes important. Other thing is drug dosages. So inadequate duration of treatment. The child, you started a treatment, you need to wait at least 5 half-lives of AED at a particular dosage before it reaches a steady state. So unless you have given the time to titrate, the child is having seizures, you start changing medications, you have not given enough time for a given drug. So suboptimal doses of AED may lead to apparent refractory seizures. In fact, in one of the study, 1 in 3 with uncontrolled seizures were controlled with increased dosages and achieving seizure remission. So make sure you have reached the, given the full time, reached to full dosage of given appropriate medication. In spite of that, if there is episodes are coming through, then you think of problems. On the other hand, very high dosages can also lead on to seizures, especially with phenytoin. Phenytoin, I don't think so any of the pediatricians who use this as a regular maintenance drug, because there are far better the drugs which are available with a safe therapeutic window. Drug compliance is other thing which is important. 50% of ER visits are secondary to not taking the anti-epileptics as directed. So they come back with recurrence of seizures. They can be both iatrogenic and patient related. What are the patient related factors? First thing is, how can my child have epilepsy? There is normal birth, and other big problem is you can have a normal EEG, You can have a normal MRI. Does that make it not, it's not epilepsy or epileptic seizure? If you have a normal MRI, normal EEG in the initial period, or even 2-3 EEGs can also be normal. They can still be epileptic seizures. So once you have these things, parents in the back of the mind, see, my child is having some abnormal movements, nothing on the MRI, nothing on the EEG. How can my child have epilepsy? It is not epilepsy. I'll not give the drugs. So that could be one of the initial thing. Financial constraints, but many of the drugs are much more cost effective as of now. That might be a less of a factor, but that should be other thing which should be considered. Difficulty tolerating side effects, as you can see in this picture, wherein there is a significant gingival hypertrophy, many other sedation, irritation, poor appetite, as in topiramate. All those things can be a difficult thing which make them to be poorly compliant. Frequent seizures in spite of medication or memory impairment. All these things contribute to non-compliance. Iatrogenic factors, long interval between visits to physician can also be one of the factor. This is one of the things as pediatrician we need to understand. Complicated medication regimes. You need to give at morning 8 o'clock, evening also exactly at 8 o'clock. Many of the parents, especially mothers, become very paranoid. So you don't have to be very strict with the regimes. It can be slightly flexible. You can give it at 8 o'clock when the child wakes up, has breakfast. Sometimes she's sleeping early, give it at 7 o'clock. Sometimes they are gone out, they have to come back home at 9 o'clock. That's fine. So 1 or 2 hours on either side, because they have a safe, the T halves are very long, and most of them are having this, they don't drop their levels so rapidly. Unless they have very frequent seizures, these drug regimens can be flexible and suit to the family's need and child's need, rather than telling that, yes, you'll have to take at exactly these levels. If the child is sleeping, wake up and give. That actually increases the non-compliance. So common seizure triggers, this is a question and answer poll.
Yes, Dr. Lucas, I have launched the poll.
Yeah.
And I've started getting the responses. So all participants, I'll request you to start voting.
Okay.
Okay. Just touching the 100 mark. And as always, I'll keep 7 seconds, doctor. Last 7 seconds.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. 5.
I think everybody is participating. That's a very good sign. They're all very active and
yeah, high response rates. 100 touches within 10 seconds.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. I end the poll here and give it to Dr. Lokesh.
Yeah.
Over to you, doctor.
So some of the seizures are particularly, especially some of the complex partial seizures, benign centrotemporal, they are more common at a specific night. Sleep deprivation definitely is a trigger factor. Overnight sleep deprivation, that's a trigger factor. Fever definitely is a trigger factor. Flashing lights, bright lights is a trigger factor in idiopathic generalized epilepsies. So all of the above is the answer. So you have all the 3 factors can trigger off seizures. So what all you can modify? You can modify the sleep deprivation, make sure their sleep hygiene is better, and also fever is better, and avoid flashing lights whenever you have idiopathic generalized epilepsy. Very good. Okay, so there are certain lesions which cause refractory epilepsies. The most common tumors are gangliogliomas, low-grade astrocytomas, DNETs, cerebroplastic neuroectodermal tumors. These are all very low-grade tumors. Their presentation, usually they don't present with raised ICT features. They present only with epilepsy, and you have to do epilepsy surgery for this group of children. Other group of refractory epilepsies, as you all know, epileptic spasms, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, CSWS, severe Dravet syndrome, structural abnormalities, and genetic epilepsy. So what are the commonly used options in drug refractory epilepsy? Commonly used options. Can we launch the poll, please? This is the last question, so that after that we'll have few interesting case discussions.
The poll has been launched. We'll wait for a few seconds, Dr. Lokesh.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we have crossed 125 mark. And last 7 seconds to go before I give it to Dr. Lokesh. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I end the poll and share the results with
Yeah.
Dr. Lokesh.
Yeah.
Go to you, doctor.
So I think most of you have got it right. So except was the question. Drug refractory epilepsy except commonly used. Now ketogenic diet is very commonly used. Resective surgeries is commonly used. Vagal nerve stimulation is commonly used. Deep brain stimulation is coming into use in a modified form. What we use for movement disorder is used in occasional cases in US. They have started using, but it is not a commonly used modality for epilepsy treatment as of now, especially in developing countries. Good. So then we'll go to the next thing. All of you are familiar with this? This slide, I think Dr. Rajesh must have showed you this slide while classifying ILE 2017 classification. So other way of looking at refractoriness, refractory seizures is what is the etiology. So based on that, whether you have tried appropriate medications or therapeutic options. So this is, we'll start with the structural. Oh, sorry, I'll just go back. So this is a child with frequent right partial seizures, very frequent postictal Todd's paresis. And what you can see here, you have to carefully look at it. So there is a depth of sulcus, what we call as depth of sulcus dysplasia in the left frontal region. On the FLAIR image, you can appreciate that well. There is hyperintense signals in these areas. And this is what is called as depth of sulcus dysplasia. It is unfortunately an eloquent area, may not be a good candidate for resective surgery. So when you have these kind of lesions at the diagnosis of epilepsy, you know you are going to be having a refractory epilepsy. You might have a very difficult time controlling the seizures. So if it is on a right side non-eloquent area, you might try resecting it. But people have tried resecting because sometimes if there is a epilepsy, this one focus is there for long period, your the eloquent areas might have been shifted to other areas. So they might have to do grid monitoring and map the areas and see if the motor cortex is shifted somewhere else. Then you can still consider surgical intervention in the lesion at this area as well. This is quite gross, as you can see. This is the left hemisphere and this is the right hemisphere. So this child had left hemiplegia and refractory epilepsy on the left side. So it is polymicrogyria, which is seen on this extensive polymicrogyria. So these are the sort of structural abnormalities which give rise to refractory epilepsies, where surgical interventions can be considered. This is lissencephaly with agenesis of corpus callosum. They can have epilepsies which are extremely difficult to control. You can just only ameliorate. The target in this sort of situation with such diffuse abnormalities would be to just avoid hospitalization, avoid status epilepticus. These are the two things. The target of trying to stop seizures in this group is just to make sure they don't come into hospital with repeated seizures. This is other forms of acquired lesions which cause refractory epilepsy. This is cystic changes in the parieto-occipital region, secondary to perinatal asphyxia. And this is one thing, whatever the talk it might be, I just always make point to request all of you pediatricians, you are the ones who can save these brains. This is a baby who had day 3, day 4 seizures, term child, who had a brain like you and me. And whatever the reason for the hypoglycemia, be it large for date, IUGR, the child was in phototherapy and was not feeding well, primary mother was not able to feed the child well, and the sugars were not monitored. If you have a symptomatic hypoglycemia, you land up with these sort of lesions in the bilateral medial occipital lesion. You have 99% chance that you are having a significant disability all your life. So if you pick up a child with asymptomatic hypoglycemia, the chance of having significant long-term disability is extremely low. So you know, we are the group of children, newborn babies who are at high risk for hypoglycemia. Please monitor them. Prevent symptomatic neonatal hypoglycemia. Once you prevent it, you have made a huge difference to these families. There is not even a single day, all of us pediatric neurologists, a day goes by without seeing a child with neonatal hypoglycemic injury, and it is a pervasive, it's their lifelong, they have problems, epilepsy, visual impairment, autism, you name it, they all have all the neurological complications. So please, all of you, look after a lot of newborn babies, have a policy on your unit, monitor them aggressively, prevent neonatal hypoglycemic brain injury. It's a sincere request from all of us. And it's just many of the patients, we just have to sit and cry with the family because we can't help them. Neither the seizure get controlled, nor the vision improves. Some of them are cerebral visually blind for their life after neonatal hypoglycemic brain injury. That's how devastating it can be. The second group of refractory epilepsies are genetic epileptic encephalopathies. You have group of early onset epileptic encephalopathies, channelopathies, which can be potassium, sodium, and calcium channelopathies. So yes, they are refractory, but it is helping us to understand a lot of things about why this epileptogenesis happens, and also trying to get any designer drugs are coming in. So there is one mutation called KCN2 mutation, wherein generally in newborn seizures or infants, early infancy, we don't try to use actually the oxcarbazepine, phenytoin on longer run, those kind of things. But this is one mutation wherein KCN2 Q2 mutation, you can actually use one of the sodium channel blockers, which if it is a benign or not so severe forms of epilepsy, gives you a good control. So then coming to the metabolic causes. So you have common conditions, phenylketonuria, which can present with epileptic spasms if you have not screened in the newborn period, biotinidase deficiency, glucose transporter 1 deficiency, pyridoxine dependency, pyridoxal 6-phosphate deficiency. We'll just quickly go through the examples. Siddharth, how much time do I have?
Sorry.
Okay.
Oh, yes, we've got about 20 minutes, but you can go on for, I mean, you've got plenty of time.
Okay, sure. So this is a 34-weeker. The video plays. Yeah. You can see the seizures, clonic jerking and a spasm. Clonic jerking and a spasm. Very, very unusual type of seizure. 34-weeker, 2 MRIs normal, no perinatal asphyxia, hypotonia, feeding difficulties, uncontrolled on 4 anti-epileptic medications, midazolam drip and pyridoxine. What are the options for us in this sort of situation? So you have a EEG which is bad, frequent discharges with decremental responses. You can see this almost a burst suppression pattern. So you normally think of, okay, you again pyridoxine, maybe add biotin, no response. So it is generally a poor prognosis. You don't have clues on the EEG, no family history except that as a consanguineous family. So can think of autosomal recessive disorder. When we sent off the genetic testing, he came positive for a pyridoxine 5-phosphate oxidase deficiency. So normally most of us are used to start pyridoxine at 100 milligram per day. When any child less than 2 years of age, you have failed 2 medications, MRI normal, EEG not showing any other syndromic diagnosis, it's worthwhile giving a trial of pyridoxine even in a child with hypoxia HIE. So that is one dictum we all follow. Some situations, this is not common, but some situations, if your pyridoxine is failing, you are sending off your genetics, may be worthwhile trying pyridoxal 5-phosphate supplementation, which is easily available. There is something called Tetrafol Plus, which is available as 25 milligram tablet. So that can also be used. So this is one drug which started very early, can actually save the life and improve the outcomes. So normally we think of pyridoxine, this one. So this is pyridoxal 5-phosphate, which can be used. So this is a 1-month-old child with normal perinatal history. Next case, that child we started pyridoxal 5-phosphate and were better controlled seizures, but had some cognitive delay. Recurrent episodes of generalized seizures from day 20 of life. 3 anti-epileptics were tried, no response. Head circumference was normal, no dysmorphism, no neurocutaneous markers, but the child didn't have any eye contact by the time and mild generalized hypotonia. Interestingly, the firstborn child had a similar history and had died at 3 months of age. So what you can see in this child here, there is dryness of skin. We can see flaking of skin over the face. You have clear alopecia. So once you see this, you know what is the clinical and genetic diagnosis is. So what is it? You can start firing your answers into the chat box. So all of you should think of a treatable epilepsy syndrome. This previous child has died without a diagnosis with this syndrome, which should not happen in this era. There is significant hypomyelination associated with that. And on follow-up with biotin 10 milligram twice daily, 7 months, completely normal, off anti-epileptic medications, no seizures. So it's a biotinase deficiency. So your metabolic disorders, treatable, can present with refractory epilepsy, where you, looking at the clinical signs at the bedside, can make a diagnosis, start the supplements, can make a life-saving difference, because starting it early saves their cognition. If you start the same thing at the end of 3 months or 4 months of refractory epilepsy, it will obviously have problems. So that is another supplementation which helps in refractory epilepsies. So this is a 4-year-old girl who had onset of seizure at 9 months, normal birth and development history, hyperactivity and speech delay was there. And then she started having myoclonic jerks in last 1 year, 10 to 20 per day. Falls were also noted. Her examination was normal, including the head size, no neurocutaneous markers, no clues. And the EEG showed generalized discharges. MRI was completely normal, poorly controlled on sodium valproate, clobazam, lamotrigine. So where do we go from here? So you don't have any clues. You are getting generalized discharges, myoclonus and GTCS. These are the 2 types of seizures. It could be idiopathic generalized, but there is some delay in the development. Idiopathic generalized epilepsy starting at 9 months is unusual. So something else was going on. First time only the grandparents had come, first 1 or 2 visits. Then the mother had come. Compliance was ensured. Review history was reviewed again. Adequacy of dosages was checked. Everything was fine. Then there was increased frequency of seizures before meals was mother had noted. This is a extremely subtle information while you are taking the history and refractory epilepsy. So if the frequency of seizures increase before meals, always think of glucose transporter 1 deficiency. So CSF showed 28 sugar as compared to 96 of plasma sugar, blood sugar. So CSF lactate was normal, and so this established a diagnosis of glucose transporter 1 deficiency. And obviously your treatment of choice is avoid phenobarbital and ketogenic diet. So ensuring compliance was big issue in this child, but we could get significant seizure control after starting ketogenic diet. So one of the clues, you may not get in all of these children, but when you're stuck, I think you should have a standard tick box questions going through. Okay, what are the things, what type of seizures, when is it happening, what are the trigger factors, do you find a time where it is more, where it is less? I think if you go through as a tick box thing, it will be very useful to pick up. These are not very common. It has a very varied manifestation. Normal head circumference is noted in lots of children with glucose transporter 1 deficiency. Normally when you learn, we think that GLUT1 comes with a small head, refractory epilepsy, and they are cognitively significantly impaired. But we have children like this who are not having a severe phenotype. So they can have myoclonic epilepsy, absence epilepsy, generalized epilepsy. Early infantile epilepsy is the one which will present with progressive microcephaly. They can have significant movement disorder as well. So then coming to, so those were all the metabolic disorders of epilepsy where your supplementation or change in the diet can make a difference to the outcome of the refractory epilepsy. Then immune mediated epilepsies, NMDA or encephalitis, all of you as pediatricians today are very well aware as compared to what it was 5 years back, that it can present with epilepsy, it can present with dystonias and mutism and significant movement disorder. So they can have epilepsy as one of the manifestation, So in fact, many of the epilepsy units today, before going out with epilepsy surgery, actually they look for antibody studies. And some of them, if they are very young babies, they do a genetic studies, and then they offer the resective epilepsy surgeries or other epilepsy surgeries. So NMDA receptor encephalitis, they can have varied forms of seizures. VGKC is usually faciobrachial seizures. But as a pediatrician, pediatric neurologist, we must admit we see it very rarely as compared to NMDA encephalitis, which is far more common. VGKC related encephalitis, where the seizures are far more frequent, is seen rarely. Whereas anti-GAD65 antibody related disease, not very common for you in a daily practice, but we had a child with IDDM, and she was around 6 years, reasonably well controlled, but she was still struggling around 200, 300 of sugars, and came to us with refractory epilepsy. Whatever you did, 5 anti-epileptics tried, everyday seizures, false. Then, because we know that IDDM is associated with anti-GAD antibodies, so we did anti-GAD antibodies, the titers were significantly elevated, and then we offered, we can't give immunomodulation, we gave IVIG followed by rituximab. She's completely seizure free for last 1 year, touch wood. So everyday seizures for 4 months with all the anti-epileptics, but because we thought it could be immune mediated, tested for anti-GAD, and then found it positive, treated with immunomodulation, she's completely symptom free. So I think when we are stuck with refractory epilepsies, there are a lot of things other than just looking at surgery. These other things should also be looked into, which you might give you a option for treatment and make a difference to epilepsies. Okay, I think so. We'll just quickly go through the last part of the talk. I'll just quickly go through the newer anti-epileptics because we are going to be using them more and more often. You will see a lot of prescriptions coming out of pediatric neurologists, which contains a lot of these drugs and which are in routine use. But most of them, there are no head-to-head comparisons of the previous AEDs. There are no specific syndromes which these drugs have been tested. So it becomes difficult. So it will be usually post-marketing surveillance. You get experience from the pediatric use, and then you know, okay, this might help in these conditions. So lacosamide is one drug which has been there for quite some time, and now we are using it very regularly as a replacement for the clobazam many a times, because clobazam comes with lot of behavioral side effects, sedation, whereas this does not have, and as a good IV preparation as well, in which can be used in status epilepticus. It works by slow inactivation of sodium channel. I'm not going to go into the mechanism of actions here. It is safe. It is effective in around 50% of children, and with giving more than 50% reduction in the seizure frequency. And seizure freedom can be seen in up to 24%. We use it very regularly. Quite a good drug to use, but it can exacerbate some of the generalized seizures. This drug is good for focal and some forms of generalized, because it's a sodium channel blocker, slow inactivating sodium channel. It works better in the focal seizures. Epidual X. How many of you actually have tried CBD oil or Epidual X, which is I think many of the parents with refractory epilepsy, when they go on the net, they find this CBD oil. So can we try in my child, and how do we get it? What is the dosage? This is a question we frequently encounter in a day-to-day clinical practice. So there is a clear study which shows in Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome, there is a significant seizure reduction, up to 40 to 50% reduction in the seizures with the Epidual X, which is a form of CBD oil, cannabis oil. And it works better with a combination of clobazam, but a very small dosage of clobazam. And side effects include drowsiness and irritability. So this is another drug in armamentarium, not a very promising drug. We have used in few children, but getting the Epidual X as such is difficult. So many of the parents get drugs from either Amazon or some other sites like this, which are some CBD oil, which are used for health and other things. So they won't consent the exact concentration, which is of medicinal value. So this is another drug which people are using. Tuberous sclerosis complex is most common neurocutaneous disorder with refractory epilepsy. So you have epileptic spasms in this 2-year-old child, onset at 8 months. came with left focal seizures, 2 to 5 per day, partial response to vigabatrin, oral steroids, all these drugs tried. Drop attacks were continuing, developing autistic features. What are the next therapeutic options you have? So here we are, so if you have a SEGA like this, these are hematomas. So sometimes if they are small in size, you can actually reduce the size with the drug mTOR inhibitor. So everolimus is the drug which is has enough evidence to say it can actually improve the epilepsy, significantly reduce the rate of epilepsy, reduce the size of the tumors, and if started early, many of them may not require surgical intervention. That is the degree of how it can help. So we are talking of anti-seizure drugs. All of them are anti-seizure drugs. This is it's a disease modifying agent in epilepsy. It is a anti-epileptogenic, but in tuberous sclerosis or mTOR pathway disorders. The common side effects what we have faced is oral ulcers. The commonest problem is oral ulcers. Weight loss is one of the thing. Most importantly, it's expensive, but we try to use it at least a low dosage along with other medications, because it has a beneficial effect on multiple aspects. The adenoma sebaceum, they become flatter, they become less apparent. That is also one of the added benefit. In fact, people are trying to get a ointment of everolimus for this. Other drug which you might see people using it frequently will be Fycompa or perampanel. It's a orally administered, highly selective, non-competitive anti-glutamate receptor antagonist. It has a broad spectrum of activity. Predominantly, obviously, the new drugs are being developed for medically refractory epilepsy, predominantly in Dravet and LGS, because those are the two conditions wherein you know that they will have lifelong epilepsy. So people try predominantly on those group of children. So you have LGS effective in 19 to 25%, super refractory status in 17% responders. But we are using it very regularly in children. It's off-label use. It is licensed for 12 years and above. Off-label use, the experience is only few of them, maybe 20 or 30% of them do respond, because all of them we are using it in refractory epilepsies. So this is another drug which you might see people using it frequently. Brivaracetam, which is synaptic vesicle 2A ligand, which is approved for 4 years and above. Similar to sort of levetiracetam, all the indications are similar, but it has 16 times more potent binding to the synaptic vesicle 2A ligand, which might actually have a better efficacy is what has been showed, but it is not across the spectrum. But it has a better side effect profile, that's for sure. Very quick titration, easy to use. So if you want to give some drug which is very quick titration without too much of cognitive side effects, this can be one of the drugs. So once you have tried all the drugs, after all the this one, then you are looking at alternative modalities, which includes ketogenic diet. Surgical intervention includes non-resective vagal nerve stimulation, some deep brain stimulation, which is evolving. Resective surgeries, mesial temporal sclerosis, not a very common disease in pediatric age group. Lesionectomy, if there is a DNET or something, and extratemporal resective surgeries. Mesial temporal surgeries are the ones which have the best outcomes. So all the other ones have a variable outcome. Frontal lobe surgeries may be 50%, mesial temporal lobe can go up to 80% success rate in surgical outcomes. So ketogenic diet will not go into the details of the process, but what you have to remember is you are stuck with seizures, either Lennox-Gastaut or refractory epileptic spasms. Child is 1 year, you have tried all the medications, swallowing is okay, try ketogenic diet. It might help, it improves the quality of life, and it has to be supervised properly by a dietitian who is well versed with dealing with infants with ketogenic diet. So if the ketogenic diet fails, then you are looking at surgical options. Ketogenic diet is tried in non-surgical patients where you can't do resective surgeries. First thing is refractory surgery, failed medications. Can you do a surgical resective surgery. That's the best outcome. If you cannot do resective surgery, multiple lesions like tuberous sclerosis, even tuberous sclerosis, they try to take out a small area if it is one area is firing more than the other. But if you have multiple areas of lesion like neonatal hypoglycemic brain injury or a large area of structural deficit where you cannot afford to do a resective surgery, then you look at ketogenic diet followed by non-resective surgeries, which includes the vagal nerve stimulation. Now, I think more than 100 children have been implanted with the newer version of the vagal nerve stimulator. We used to use quite a lot while we were in UK, but the device was out of this one, and new versions have come in last 4 or 5 years, and there has been reasonable good efficacy. You don't get seizure free with refractory this one, but the intensity of seizures, quality of life would improve with this device. So receptive surgeries, as we said, almost 80% seizure free. Extratemporal resection, only 40 to 50% of being seizure free, but that is also a good percentage. Other surgeries include corpus callosotomy and functional hemispherotomies. So going back to the point, if you have a child with refractory seizure, go back to see whether it is epileptic seizure. Confirm that again. Go back to see whether it is a appropriate semiologic diagnosis has been achieved and you have appropriate syndromic diagnosis. And your drug has been used, appropriate drug has been used in appropriate dosages, and enough time has been given for the drug to act. If all of this have been done and your MRI shows a clear lesion, go in for early resective surgeries. If non-lesional, you look at all the treatable in the categories. I think using that ILEA slide according to categories, going through that systematically actually is going to be quite helpful. Thank you. Siddharth?
Yes, Lokesh, thank you
Yeah.
very much. Of course, you know, first of all, you made it so simple. So, and kept us all glued to it and covered everything, I think. So we've had lots of compliments come in, a lot of people saying it was a very nice presentation and they enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And like more in future.
Yeah.
So now we've got a number of questions that have also come in and they're very interesting. So
Okay.
I'll probably read them out and I'll let you speak to our
Oh,
audience.
Dr. Siddharth, I am Samir here. Before we move to questions, can I just take 1 minute of yours for a very quick feedback from the participants? Will it be fine, Doctor?
Let us do that.
So requesting all the participants here, before we move to a Q&A with Dr. Lokesh and Dr. Siddharth, I just need your 1 minute to respond to 2 feedback questions, which I'll keep it for 15 seconds each. And
Okay.
I'm launching it right now.
Okay.
Yeah. So requesting all the participants, did this session improve your understanding of the topic? Correct. So just if I want to have some responses, we'll keep it for a while and the poll. And most of the time, yes. So last few seconds to go. Most of them have already participated here, and I end the poll now. Yes. So these are the results. 98% has already said yes, definitely. So compliments to you, Dr. Lokesh. I think most of 98% has said it was really interesting to have listened from you. So I move to the next question now.
Now it's
To all
important
the,
to know. It's important to know where the maybe what we can improve. The
yeah,
people who
we'll
have said
take it in
maybe
the comments.
they can give us a personal feedback so that we can improve.
Sure, doctor. Sure.
Okay.
So I move to the next question now, and
Yeah.
requesting all the participants to vote it for next 50 seconds before we move to the Q&A. Give me a second.
So I think Dr. Rajesh Joshi has asked, everolimus, yes, it reduces the tuber size. It doesn't require sort of they in the Western world they have. Sorry, you have something again?
We'll just finish this last.
I will just take one more question.
Yeah, sure,
Dr.
sure.
Lokesh.
Okay, sure.
To answer the questions. Thank you.
So the question overall, how would you rate RIC and epilepsy webinars? You all can respond to the last 4 days of the responses which we have. Last 5 seconds to go. Yeah, I stop the poll here and I end the poll. Over to you, Dr. Sid and Dr. Lokesh.
Yeah, so again, thank you very much for everybody to vote and say that these were they're excellent and very good. And I hope you haven't just said it, because you know we've really tried to cater it to the audience, and got, of course, you know, whoever's an expert in this subject to speak on them. Of course, the speakers take a lot of effort in preparing these slides and getting everything together and preparing themselves. So I'm really pleased that everybody has enjoyed. So I think we'll quickly move on to the question answers, and just share my screen there.
Yeah.
So I'll go from the questions that we've received in order. So the first question was, to label shuddering, is it necessary
Yeah.
to do an EEG and an MRI?
Absolutely not required. Absolutely not required. Just see the video and that is good enough. That's why I think seeing the videos is the most important thing here, and taking the history that always during the awake period, most of the epileptic spasms would have some regression of the vision and cognition, which is not there, no relation to waking up from the sleep. Most of the spasms just after waking up within few minutes, they have the in cluster. So here it is not like that, and they are always alert throughout this one. They can repeat on your command. So it is not required.
Yeah. So what is the treatment for psychogenic epilepsy or psychogenic seizures that you see in your clinic?
Yeah, so most of the psychogenic non-epileptic seizures are because of a emotional turmoil what the child is going through. Either it's a stress at school, fight with a friend, or emotional turmoil at home, between the parents there is a fight. So we need to address that. So something, it's just like asking for help. He is not able to ask for help, and then you are getting the this one so manifestation as psychogenic non-epileptic event.
Yes. Do you often?
So a psychologist need to be involved, if required a psychiatrist.
Yes, yes. I think, but the results are quite good in childhood, aren't they? I mean, from our
Yes, absolutely. Unless they have gone on for more than a year without getting better, then you are in trouble. But most of them do get better quite well.
Yep, agreed. Is it necessary to give a loading dose of anti-epileptic every time the child comes to emergency department with a history of a missed dose or kind of non-compliance? That's a very good question from Sridhar Joshi.
Yeah, not required. See, if they have come with a brief seizure recurrence or even 5-minute seizure while on the way or at home, and they have come, they are completely normal when they are with you in the emergency or outpatient, this one, you just go back to the dosage, or if required, bump up the dosage. And some people give a clover for those 3 days because the drug once again might take time to achieve the level, maybe 1 tablet of lobazam or something, depending. You have to assess that depending on the requirement. Because if child had very infrequent seizures, I just put up the dosage and send them home, not giving any loading whatsoever.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Regarding everolimus, as you were trying to answer that question, there are a couple of questions. So one is, what is the dose of everolimus in tuberous sclerosis in milligrams per kilogram? And the second question is that by Joshi, does it require tubers in tuberous sclerosis, and does it require monitoring as it is an anti-neoplastic medication?
Yeah, see, the Western world definitely, actually the dosage has been given as compared in accordance to the blood levels. Actually, they don't give the milligram per kilo dosage for this drug. So unfortunately, we don't have easy access to the monitoring of the blood levels, but we are using the lowest possible dosage of around sort of because it's quite expensive. 0.5 to 1 milligram tablet itself costs around 850. The lowest version of it costs around 850 to 900 per 10 tablets. Yes. So we use the lower dosages without monitoring, and it has helped in many children with refractory, but not obviously in all of them because we can't keep titrating. Monitoring levels, yes, if you have facility, probably yes. But as I said, of side effects wise, the most common side effect you will encounter is only 2. That is oral ulcer formation, and other thing is weight loss. Rest of the things, we have used it for 3-4 years now in many of the patients without any side effects.
Thank you. The next question is, what is the, and I think it's very relevant as you stressed about NHBI and the refractoriness. So somebody has, what is the role of epilepsy surgery in patients with refractory seizures and NHBI?
I think there are some centers who are attempting to do posterior quadrantectomy. That is provided if you know that only one part of your occipital lobe is firing. Sometimes they are mostly symmetric lesions, but we have seen children where one quadrant is significantly affected and other, that is the quadrant which is giving rise to lots of seizures. So there are certain centers who attempt posterior quadrantectomy, but that is only a very, very small percentage who will fulfill that criteria, I would say.
Okay. Okay. Now,
Yeah.
somebody wants to know how many days
Yeah.
do you need to wait for adding pyridoxal phosphate as a trial after you've added pyridoxal?
Yeah, so there are no guidelines on this. Remind you, this we are dealing with extremely rare forms of disorders. Do you know what is the incidence of pyridoxine dependency? It's only 1 in 8 lakh population. So it's extremely rare. Whereas biotin deficiency is 1 in 40 to 60,000. So that is far more common. Biotin deficiency is far more common than pyridoxine dependency. So this is even more rarer. The pyridoxal 5-phosphate is even more rarer. So if you are stuck and you have given in acute care setting in the newborn unit, you are giving the medications, even for after 3 days, the child is still having, probably go ahead and start pyridoxal tetrafol plus.
Yeah. And I would
In a
imagine
newborn setting.
if you're in a ICU setup and if you've got refractory seizures, we would give IV pyridoxine. And if it doesn't
Yes.
respond, probably they escalate and try.
Then escalate it to pyridoxal 5-phosphate. True.
Naveen Bhardwaj, he wants to know, in status epilepticus, we don't give a third dose of midazolam, as it is said, some regulation of GABA receptors happens and it doesn't work. So how come it works when we shift the child to PICU, and why do they give it then?
No. I think that is very semantic. We use midazolam drip, obviously. It is not that, because see, once you have given the same mechanism action drug multiple times, it doesn't make sense. So you are trying to use 3 different medications, 3 different mechanism of actions.
Yes.
One is your GABA, benzodiazepines. Other one is you work on your sodium valproate, sodium channel, and other group of drugs. Then you use either lacosamide, which is used many times these days, which acts on a slow inactivating sodium channels. So that way you are acting on different mechanisms and converging to reduce these are all anti-seizure, as we said. It's not anti-epileptogenic. So you are using different mechanisms and reducing the side effect of a single drug and increasing the efficacy.
Yeah. I think you've kind of answered this question.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how good is VNS?
How good is VNS? Yes. So you are stuck to wall. You are having lots of status epilepticus. You are having admissions, frequent admissions because of seizures, falls because of seizures. Then the parents know and agreeing that it will not give us seizure control in spite of spending 7-8 lakhs for the surgery and the device. But I will make sure that at least you will not be getting into hospital, you will not be falling and breaking his head frequently. That is the sort of situation wherein you go in and offer vagal nerve stimulator. So complete seizure control is not an option with VNS. It improves quality of life. It might help to reduce the number of anti-epileptic medications you are on. And there are devices where you can actually wand kind of thing or a watch kind of wrist band kind of thing where you do it, rub it around this one magnet. It will stop the seizure as well. So a lot of things, advances which have happened, but obviously the cost versus the understanding of the family that it is not a complete seizure control, but it improves the overall things, then you offer them.
Yes. So next question from Rashmi Kumar. In what situation or indirectly, what are the indications when you would use zonisamide in refractory patients?
Yeah, so zonisamide is a good drug, both in generalized epilepsies and focal epilepsies, but I would reserve it sort of the second or third line medication, mostly because of the side effects associated, almost similar to topiramate, but slightly less than topiramate. So you can try it in epileptic spasms or LGS kind of situation. Any refractory focal epilepsies you can try. Be aware that it can increase the seizure urinary frequency increase is one of the common side effects many of these children face, along with all the other side effects almost similar to your topiramate. So, but the what do you call the appetite reducing side effect of topiramate is not as much with the zonisamide as compared to the topiramate.
Yes. The next question is from Dipti, and she wants to know, do all symptomatic focal cortical dysplasias require lifelong AED? So I can see the audience is already thinking about etiologies, and we've got a lot of relevant questions. And what is the
Yeah.
prognosis for surgery if the FCD is in, say, a frontal lobe, left frontal lobe somewhere?
Yeah. See, once again, here, if you are already known now that you have decided that it is a non-resectable. So you have to be resolved to, yes, I'm going to have, my patient is going to have seizures. I want to keep him safe. I want to keep him out of the hospital. These are the two targets you are going to discuss with the family. I'm not complete seizure control. You have tried everything. Try everything. One go, you give drugs. There's, as we discussed, all the drugs which are available in the market we discussed today. So you try that. And then if you are not able to achieve control, then you say the parents, see, we are going to stick to this 2 or 3 medications maximum, and then we achieve this control. This is what we're going to be able to offer to your child.
Yes. Sanjita wants to know, what is functional hemispherectomy or spherotomy?
Yeah, so you are just like a disconnection of the corpus callosum. You are not completely taking off the this one. Hemispherectomy is just take off the brain material from there, because they continue to seize from those areas. Here you just disconnect the corpus callosum kind of.
Yes. It used to sound quite dramatic, isn't it? I think when we think of chopping out the brain and the
brain and yeah.
But we've seen it go ahead, and you've established a very good epilepsy surgery program at your place. So I'm sure you're dealing with this quite often at the moment.
Sure.
Yeah. So another relevant question about etiologies is when to suspect metabolic epilepsy and when to suspect genetic origin of epilepsy.
Yeah, I think very relevant questions. So metabolic epilepsies, most of them do have onset before sort of 2 years of age, very early in infancy. But especially pyridoxal phosphate can be tricky. That they can have before 2 years, anytime they can have presentation, not necessarily always in the newborn period. In fact, we had a child who had seizures on and off, and he failed 2 medications. He was put, because it was a young onset epilepsy, we put it on, started him on pyridoxine. He got controlled. On the way, somewhere in between, he stopped it, and then he didn't come back with his papers and had super refractory status.
Yep.
And after 48 hours, we realized that he was on this medication, pyridoxine, and we started, in fact, even we use isoflurane for super refractory status. That didn't help. So we started isoflurane, and then after that, we added 1 dosage of your pyridoxine, and it stopped. Everything stopped. And it was mutation proven, pyridoxine dependent epilepsy. After this, we did the mutation. So any child you have for biotinidase deficiency, you have clinical clues. For PKU and the epileptic spasms, you have clinical clues in the form of hypopigmented hairs and skin abnormalities in the form of eczema. Yeah. So there you have clinical clues. For GLUT1, you don't have clinical clues. They can present in any form. High index of suspicion is extremely important, taking that history. The associated movement disorders, if you have in a child with epilepsy, think of glucose transporter 1 deficiency. So metabolic epilepsies less than 2 years, and common ones are these. Genetic epilepsies, you have a child with bad epilepsy, your MRI is normal, bang normal, but child has 100 seizures a day. Yes. You know you are looking at a metabolic epilepsy, a genetic epilepsy. Epileptic encephalopathies. Now the numbers are expanding. I don't think so any of us can remember the numbers actually. So every day you find one new genetic mutation. So that is when you suspect genetic epilepsies. Yeah.
So I'll take along the next question, which is relevant to it. What are the investigations you would do to diagnose genetic cause for refractory epilepsy?
I think first you go through the whole exome. So you have done your very accurate phenotyping, have a good MRI, good EEG, good metabolic workup, and then you have ruled out the treatable causes at the bedside, and then you do the whole exome sequencing. That is a test. If you fail whole exome, still you are strongly suspecting, then looking for deletions and other things, you might have to look at doing a microarray, but microarray yield is extremely low as compared to the whole exome sequencing.
Yeah. Again, sticking to the etiology about vitamin responsive epilepsies, how commonly do you
Yeah.
see them outside of neonatal period? And another separate question is, are they temporary or do they need lifelong supplementation?
Yeah, supplementation is lifelong. In fact, anti-epileptics are not lifelong because you can get rid of anti-epileptics with pyridoxine dependency, biotinidase deficiency. You don't require anti-epileptics, but the supplement is lifelong.
Yeah. In fact, they respond beautifully to it, isn't it? It's not just that.
Absolutely phenomenal. That's why I showed that image of that child within 6 months, no anti-epileptics, no seizures, only biotin.
Agreed completely.
Yeah.
More questions if you're not tired yet. We've got about 5 minutes. We'll make most of your presence today. So
Okay.
he wants to know what is your experience about behavior disturbance associated with Breviact? How common is it? He shares his experience that he has definitely seen it in one case where it was suspected.
Yeah. See, we have used around 60 children. We have used brivaracetam, and in around 10% of patients, there were a new onset of behavioral issues, but it was much better than the levetiracetam associated problems. So in fact, there was improvement in the behavioral issues when we shifted from levetiracetam to brivaracetam. New onset when we started brivaracetam as a first drug without exposed to what we call live-naive patients, we find some patients had behavioral issues, but never as bad as with the levetiracetam. But that's what the experience is, and outside this one as well. Efficacy wise, we are not able to make out it is much better, but in 1 or 2 patients, in fact, we have a child with a drug epilepsy surgery failed patient who got controlled with brivaracetam in last 1 year. So these are 1 or 2 cases, but it is a good drug we can try.
Would you suggest the use of B6 vitamin supplementation if you've got behavior issues and with levetiracetam?
I don't have much of experience on that. I don't know whether you people have it.
Yeah, there was some literature around, and I think we've tried it in few patients. But yes, so I just wanted to know. An interesting question from Asim Shrestha. Any theories that can explain drug-resistant epilepsy? Why does it happen in certain children?
See, I think we went through the list of causes, didn't we? So each etiology is completely different. It's basically the neuronal network which starts, the inhibitory mechanism is failing, and the excitatory mechanism is in that network is firing because either because it's a mutation in the sodium channel or potassium channel, which is keeping the channels open for longer period, producing extra electricity. Either it's a neonatal hypoglycemic brain injury. If you see the EEGs of neonatal hypoglycemic brain injury when they are 10 years, every time they are sleeping, it is like a secondary CSWS. That is the kind of EEG you see. So which means that what we see externally is small. Internally, the neurons are connected in such a wrong way that they're firing all the time. So whatever the etiology, be it the structural focal cortical dysplasia, acquired neonatal hypoglycemic brain injury, or a epileptic encephalopathy gene, they are just firing all the time. It's like a wildfire, actually, if you have to compare. And whatever you are trying to douse with your anti-seizure medications is not changing the epileptogenesis. So that is why you continue to have with particular types of genetic mutations and the particular pathologies.
Yes. So I'll stick with drug refractory epilepsy. And somebody has asked, Dr. Kaumil Joshi has asked, how much should one worry about the use of steroid for refractory epilepsy? So I think that question is not very clear, but I think why don't you mention about steroids and refractory epilepsy in your experience?
Yeah. One of the common situation is if you have a epileptic encephalopathic EEG and you have very frequent discharges, whatever the reason for the epilepsy might be, it's worthwhile a trial if there is a risk of infection is not much. Or even in other situation like you have a super refractory status, all of us once we rule out an infectious process, we give methylprednisolone as a membrane stabilizing effect. It has some effect in reducing the frequency of seizures in super refractory status. But in our experience of almost more than 40 children of super refractory status, I cannot put my hand on my heart and say yes, it definitely helped in this many. It's very difficult. But in a child with epileptic encephalopathic EEG, very frequent seizures, not in a SRSC setting, worthwhile a trial, and it can benefit a lot of children, but monitor for the side effects and monitor the glucose and weight gain, explain the parents about the risk factors of infection and other things.
Yeah. Do you prefer a particular preparation? So is it ACTH, is it methylprednisolone, or is it oral prednisolone? What would you
Yeah, outside the setting of epileptic spasms, I'm not using ACTH. It is usually the oral high dosage prednisolone, around 3 milligram per kilo, or 4 I'm not used so much, although that's what the recommendation says, but in Indian setting, we do not know what you are up to. So sort of 3 milligram per kilo. And injectable methylprednisolone in many of these patients who they side effect, if they have already been exposed once and they had bad side effects to oral this one, then give pulse methylprednisolone 3 days and then repeat it after a month, like that for 3 months.
Yes. So I think still there are a number of unanswered questions, but I'll take one more. One of the questions was, there are often children, so I think the pediatricians would be experiencing that they've been to the neurologist or one hospital or another, and there are children who come to them with, say, a prescription of 4 drugs. They're on 4 drugs.
Yeah.
So what do they do about these children? Do you monitor anything particularly? Do you do drug levels? And if you want to taper any of the drugs, how should you do that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting and important question. We actually, in our unit, that's a unit-wise policy, we don't actually monitor the drug levels unless in acute setting, like you are treating a super refractory status with 30 milligram per kilo of phenobarbital. Then you monitor the drug levels are very high dosage of phenytoin, or you're suspecting drug toxicity. All other drugs like sodium valproate doesn't have 1:1 correlation with efficacy and the drug levels. So no point monitoring those drug levels. So the thing about this reducing the medications, always it's important, because as we go along, we lose the track of what worked for the child and what side effects was there with the given medication. We try to take off the least effective medication and the one which caused most difficult. So if somebody is on sodium valproate, clobazam, topiramate, so I would take off topiramate because that has significant dyscognitive effects on children's learning. In fact, they can stop speaking as well in some of these children. So weight loss, and especially in these high temperatures, it's impossible to tolerate topiramate. So I would take off topiramate first, and then you see the side effect of clobazam will be worse than the valproate. But also you should look at what was the best drug to control the seizures. So you need to factor in best drug to control the seizures, worst side effect. So based on that, you taper the medications one after the other.
Yeah. So yes, that all makes sense. So I think I'm going to end this session right now.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank you, Lokesh, for such a wonderful interactive session. We'll have you for more sessions in future, hopefully.
Yeah, I think the participants were quite interactive. Very good, very
So
appreciated.
I'd like to thank all the participants. We had huge numbers of participants sitting at their home and taking part with Paul, listening to it and staying till the end. We'd like to thank our drug sponsor, Sanofi. And of course, I'll start from day one. So all the speakers, Dr. Sanjeev Mehta, my colleague, Dr. Nitishwara, my colleague, and then day 2, we have Dr. Brajesh Udani from Mumbai. Day 3, we had Dr. Anita Hegde. And day 4 today, we had a wonderful session with you, Lokesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.